Most people think Niccolò Machiavelli was evil, that he taught rulers how to manipulate, deceive, and destroy anyone standing in their way. His name became so infamous that even today, if someone is called Machiavellian, it means they're cold, calculating, and dangerous. But here's the question almost nobody asks. What if Machiavelli wasn't trying to create tyrants? What if he was trying to warn us about them? Because when you actually study his life, something strange appears. Machiavelli wasn't born into power. He didn't live like a king. He didn't die wealthy or respected. In fact, he spent years watching governments collapse, leaders betray their allies, and entire cities descend into chaos. And after seeing all of this firsthand, he came to one disturbing conclusion. Good intentions alone are not enough to survive in politics. That idea would make him one of the most controversial philosophers in history. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469 during the Renaissance, a period most people imagine as an age of beauty, art, and genius. But behind the paintings and architecture was a brutal political world. Italy was divided into competing city-states constantly fighting each other. Mercenaries switched sides for money, religious leaders acted like warlords, and powerful families assassinated rivals to maintain control. Machiavelli grew up watching all of this, and unlike many philosophers, he didn't spend his life imagining perfect societies. He studied failure, why nations collapse, why leaders lose power, why citizens betray republics, and why fear controls human behavior more than morality often does. These questions became the foundation of his work. When Florence became a republic in 1498, Machiavelli entered government service and quickly rose through the political ranks. For 14 years, he worked as a diplomat and political strategist. This wasn't theoretical philosophy. He traveled across Europe meeting kings, military commanders, and rulers. He observed them closely, their personalities, their weaknesses, their lies. And this is where Machiavelli began developing the ideas that would later appear in The Prince. One ruler especially fascinated him: Cesare Borgia. Borgia was feared across Italy for his intelligence and brutality. Most people would have looked at him and simply called him evil. Machiavelli looked deeper. He wanted to understand why fear worked politically, why people obey strong leaders even when they hate them, and why unstable governments often collapse under weak rulers. This became one of the central messages in Machiavelli's work. Power is not maintained through ideals alone. It is maintained through strategy, perception, and control. Now, that sounds dark. But Machiavelli wasn't necessarily celebrating it. He believed this was simply reality. And reality, according to him, was often cruel. One of the biggest misconceptions about Machiavelli is that he encouraged unlimited violence. That's not true. In fact, he repeatedly warned rulers against unnecessary cruelty. He argued that violence should be quick, calculated, and limited, because endless cruelty creates hatred, and hatred destroys rulers. This is a detail many people online completely ignore. Machiavelli believed fear could stabilize a state temporarily, but hatred always plants the seeds of destruction. That idea alone shows he was far more complex than the stereotype people imagine. And here's something even more surprising. Machiavelli actually admired republics more than dictatorships. Most people only know The Prince. But in another major work called Discourses on Livy, he praised the Roman Republic and argued that free citizens create stronger societies than absolute rulers. So why write The Prince at all? Because Machiavelli lived during chaos. Foreign invasions were tearing Italy apart. Governments were collapsing constantly, and weak leaders were getting destroyed. Machiavelli believed that when a nation is unstable, survival sometimes forces leaders to make morally difficult decisions, not because morality is worthless, but because politics is often a battle between imperfect choices. This was the heart of his philosophy. He believed human nature itself was unstable. People could be loyal one moment and selfish the next. Citizens wanted freedom, but they also wanted security. Leaders wanted peace, but they also feared losing power. To Machiavelli, politics was not about choosing between good and evil. It was often about choosing between disaster and survival. And this is what made his work revolutionary. Before Machiavelli, many political philosophers described how leaders should behave in an ideal world. Machiavelli described how leaders actually behave in the real world. That difference changed political philosophy forever, and the more you study him, the more you realize his work was less about evil and more about uncomfortable honesty. Then his own life collapsed. In 1512, the powerful Medici family returned to power in Florence. Machiavelli lost his position, was accused of conspiracy, arrested, and brutally tortured. Imagine this for a second. The man who spent years studying power suddenly became powerless himself. He was hung by ropes with his hands tied behind his back during torture sessions. His body permanently damaged, his career destroyed. After his release, he was exiled from political life and forced to live outside Florence. And this is where one of history's most influential books was born. During exile, Machiavelli spent nights studying ancient Roman history for hours. He became obsessed with one question: why did some states survive while others collapsed? That question became The Prince. But here's something fascinating most people never hear. Many historians believe The Prince was partly written as a desperate attempt to return to politics. Machiavelli dedicated the book to the Medici family, the same people who imprisoned him. He hoped they might hire him again. In other words, one of history's greatest political books may have started as a survival strategy. Which is incredibly ironic, considering the book itself is about survival and power. Now here's where Machiavelli's deeper message becomes important. Most people focus on one line from The Prince: "It is better to be feared than loved." But they ignore the rest. Machiavelli immediately warns that rulers must avoid becoming hated, because fear controls people temporarily. Hatred destroys governments permanently. This shows that Machiavelli understood psychology extremely well. He knew humans are emotional creatures. Perception matters more than facts sometimes. People judge leaders based on appearances, confidence, and strength. And whether we like it or not, modern politics still works this way. Think about that. A man writing in the 1500s understood media image, public perception, and political theater centuries before modern television or the internet existed. That's one reason his work still feels relevant today. And here's another part most people miss. Machiavelli believed ordinary citizens often protect freedom better than elites do. He distrusted powerful aristocrats because he believed they constantly seek domination. Meanwhile, common citizens mainly want security and stability. This idea heavily influenced later Republican thinkers and even some democratic ideas centuries later. So no, Machiavelli was not simply teaching rulers how to become monsters. He was studying how power actually operates beneath the surface. And sometimes, the truth he uncovered was ugly. Midway through the video, pause for a second and comment this: do you think Machiavelli was exposing corruption? Or secretly defending it? I'm genuinely curious what you think because historians still debate this today. And while you're at it, hit like and subscribe, because we're diving into stories most history classes never teach. One of Machiavelli's most important ideas was something called virtù, but this word didn't mean virtue in the modern moral sense. To Machiavelli, virtù meant strength of character, boldness, adaptability, the ability to shape events instead of being controlled by them. He believed great leaders understand when to be cautious and when to act ruthlessly, because fortune, or what he called fortuna, constantly changes. A leader who refuses to adapt eventually collapses, and honestly, this idea applies far beyond politics. Businesses fail when they refuse to adapt. Empires collapse when leaders become weak or arrogant. Even ordinary people suffer when they ignore reality and live entirely in fantasy. Machiavelli believed survival requires understanding the world as it truly is, not as we wish it were. That was his message. And perhaps that's why people still fear his ideas, because he forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. Humans are capable of loyalty, but also betrayal, capable of justice, but also selfishness. Civilization itself, according to Machiavelli, is far more fragile than people realize. And history, unfortunately, proves him right again and again. Wars, revolutions, dictatorships, political propaganda, mass manipulation. These things didn't disappear after the Renaissance. If anything, they evolved. That's why modern politicians, military strategists, CEOs, and even psychologists still study Machiavelli today. Not because they all want tyranny, but because understanding power means understanding human behavior. Near the end of his life, Machiavelli slowly faded into political irrelevance. When Florence became a republic again, many former allies distrusted him because he had worked with the Medici. He ended up trapped between both sides. A man who understood politics better than almost anyone, yet failed to secure lasting power for himself. In 1527, he died poor and disappointed. He never witnessed the massive impact his writings would have on the world. After his death, the prince spread across Europe rapidly. Some called it genius, others called it dangerous. The Catholic Church eventually banned his works, and over time his name itself became associated with manipulation and deception. But perhaps history misunderstood him. Because if you read his work carefully, Machiavelli wasn't celebrating corruption. He was exposing reality. He wanted leaders and citizens to understand the brutal mechanics of power before it was too late. In many ways, Machiavelli was holding a mirror up to humanity, and humanity didn't like what it saw. That may be why his ideas survived for over 500 years, while countless other philosophers faded into obscurity. Because deep down, the political world he described still exists. Power still shapes truth. Fear still influences society. Leaders still manage appearances carefully. And nations still struggle between morality and survival. Machiavelli understood all of this centuries ago, not because he was evil, but because he observed human nature without illusions. And maybe that honesty is what made him so dangerous. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories about history's most misunderstood thinkers. And comment below, was Machiavelli a genius realist, or the philosopher who taught the world how to manipulate itself?